In the bustling city of Lagos, where people hurried to work and vendors lined the streets selling everything from fruits to clothes, there was a small boy named John. John was only 12 years old, but he already knew a lot about survival. He had no father to guide him, no mother to comfort him, and no siblings to play with. He was alone, and every day was a challenge. Each morning, just as the sun peeked over the rooftops, John would get up from his tiny makeshift shelter. It was just a small corner in a run-down alley, where he kept his few belongings in a small plastic bag. His bed was a flattened cardboard box, and his blanket was an old cloth he'd found one rainy night. But despite this hard life, John's spirit was strong. He believed that things would get better one day, so he got up every morning with a purpose. John's main job was selling puff puff, a small golden-brown snack made of fried dough that was sweet and soft on the inside. He carried a tray of puff puffs balanced on his head, and he would walk around the busy streets calling out, "Puff puff, fresh hot puff puff, come and buy." His voice was loud, clear, and full of energy, and people would often stop to buy from him. Despite his hard work, John's income was small. Every day, after paying the lady who let him take puff puff on credit to sell, he was left with only a little cash. This money bought him just enough food to get by, and sometimes he'd save a little for his dream. His dream was simple: to go to school one day. John loved the idea of school. Whenever he passed by a school, he'd stop for a moment to watch the children learning and playing together. It seemed like such a magical place, where kids wore uniforms and carried books, laughing and talking as they went in and out of classrooms. But John knew that school was a luxury he couldn't afford just yet. So, when he wasn't selling puff puff, he found other ways to earn money. One of his favorite ways was collecting bottles. He would search the streets, especially around busy markets and bus stops, looking for plastic bottles. Sometimes people threw them away carelessly, but to John, those bottles were valuable. He could sell them to recyclers for a small price, and every bottle brought him a little closer to his dream. One day, while picking bottles, John stumbled upon a small classroom where he heard a teacher's voice. The words seemed big and important, and John couldn't understand them all, but he listened, fascinated. The teacher was talking about math and science, and John felt a strange longing to be inside that classroom, learning like the other kids. That night, John sat on his cardboard bed, thinking about school. He imagined himself in a classroom, answering questions, writing on a chalkboard, and making friends. The thought filled him with a new energy, and he promised himself that one day, he would go to school. No matter how hard he had to work, he was going to make it happen. Days turned into weeks, and John saved every money he could. He worked long hours, sometimes skipping meals just to save a little extra. Finally, after many months of hard work, he had saved enough to buy a second-hand uniform and a few books. Trembling with excitement, John walked into a nearby school and asked to be enrolled. The teachers looked at him in surprise. He was just a small boy with torn clothes and rough hands. But when he showed them his savings and asked with such determination, they saw how serious he was. The teachers decided to help him. They arranged for him to attend classes, even though he didn't have a proper guardian or anyone to sign him up officially. John was overjoyed. He sat in the classroom with other kids, his eyes shining with excitement. He was finally where he had dreamed of being for so long. John quickly became one of the brightest students in the school. He was curious about everything, and he loved reading and solving math problems. The teachers were amazed at how much he wanted to learn. Even though he didn't have anyone to help him with homework or buy him new clothes, he always came to school with a smile on his face, ready to learn. But school was only half the battle. John still needed to survive, so after classes, he would go back to selling puff puff and collecting bottles. His life was a balance of school and work, and he rarely had time for play. Yet he didn't mind. He knew he was building a future for himself, one small step at a time. One day, while walking back from school, John felt a deep pang of loneliness. He saw other children with their parents, laughing and talking as they walked home together. They held hands, their parents carrying their bags and asking about their day. John felt a tightness in his chest, a feeling he tried to ignore but couldn't. No matter how hard he worked or how many coins he saved, he was still alone. But John was a resilient boy. He wiped his tears and told himself that he didn't need anyone. He had gotten this far on his own, and he would keep going. He promised himself that one day he would be successful, and he would never have to feel lonely again. John's days at school quickly turned into years. He never let go of his street jobs and even worked harder to support his studies. His routine was relentless. Wake up early, sell puff-puff, attend classes, collect bottles after school, and study late into the night. This rhythm became his life, and every day he grew stronger, both in body and spirit. John graduated from secondary school with high honors, making his teachers proud. They marveled at how far he'd come, knowing he'd done it all alone. Some teachers even tried to find out more about his family, but John would shake his head and change the subject. For him, his family was the dream of a brighter future, the goal that kept him moving forward. After secondary school, John decided to take a break from studies. He knew he needed more money to pay for higher education, so he focused on growing his recycling business. Now, instead of only picking bottles, he set up a system where people would bring bottles to him, and he paid them a small fee. Slowly, other boys from the street, who also had nowhere to go, started working with him. John taught them how to sort the bottles, how to talk to customers, and how to manage the small earnings they made. Business was growing, and soon John was able to expand beyond just bottles. He began collecting plastic bags, cans, and even small metal scraps. His recycling venture became well known in the area, and people would come from different neighborhoods to sell their recyclables to him. John was thrilled. His business gave him a sense of purpose and pride, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he was on his way to achieving something big. Finally, with enough money saved, John enrolled himself in a university. He was nervous and excited, knowing that this was a huge step. University life was a different world, full of bright minds, books, and endless opportunities to learn. John's dedication made him a star among his classmates. Professors noticed his sharp questions and thoughtful answers, and they admired his relentless drive. However, even as his life seemed to get better, John couldn't shake off the feeling of loneliness that lingered in his heart. Whenever there were celebrations, he would see his classmates with their families, laughing and taking pictures together. John watched them from a distance, always feeling like an outsider. He tried to focus on his studies and his growing business, telling himself that one day, he would find someone to share his success with. 2 years into university, John's recycling business had grown larger than he ever imagined. He had hired several boys from the street, giving them steady work and helping them avoid the dangers he'd once faced. They all respected John and looked up to him, seeing him as someone who had risen from the same streets and succeeded. One day, John got a surprise visitor at his recycling center. A representative from the Lagos state government had come to speak with him. The man introduced himself with a smile and explained that the government had noticed John's efforts to clean up the city and reduce waste. They were impressed by his impact and wanted to support him in expanding his operations further. "We've seen young people like you rise from difficult situations, but your work is inspiring, John. We believe you have the power to make an even bigger difference," the man said with admiration. John couldn't believe it. Not long ago, he was just a boy picking bottles off the streets, and now the government wanted to work with him. This opportunity was more than he could have dreamed. He immediately accepted the offer and, with the government's support, his business grew beyond anything he could have imagined. His recycling center expanded to several locations, and he even started working with companies to recycle on a larger scale. With his recycling empire blossoming, John had more money than he'd ever known. He remembered the days when he barely had enough for food, and now he could afford anything he wanted. He bought a modest but comfortable apartment, got himself new clothes, and began to live a life he had only imagined in his dreams. But even with all the success, he still felt a deep emptiness. Graduation day arrived, And though he was surrounded by cheering classmates, John couldn't shake the feeling of loneliness. His classmates were busy with their families, hugging them and celebrating their achievements. John stood alone, watching them with a tightness in his chest, his heart heavy with longing. And then, as he was about to leave, he met Grace. Grace was one of the few people in his class he'd noticed but never really spoken to. She was always kind to everyone and had a warm, inviting smile that lit up any room. On that day, she noticed John standing alone, looking lost in thought. Without hesitation, she walked over and introduced herself. "You don't have anyone here, do you?" she asked gently, her eyes full of understanding. John felt a lump in his throat and nodded. For the first time in a long while he felt seen. Grace smiled and handed him her phone. "Here, let's take a picture together. We can celebrate together." They took a few photos and John felt the loneliness lift, even if just for a moment. They talked for hours, sharing stories about their lives and their dreams. Grace asked him about his business, and though John was initially hesitant, he opened up about his recycling company and his journey from the streets to where he was now. Grace listened with admiration and encouragement, making John feel valued in a way he hadn't before. When they parted ways, they exchanged numbers and promised to keep in touch. For the first time, John had someone he could call a friend. Over the next few months, Grace became a central part of his life. They spent time together, sharing meals, going to parks, and talking about their hopes for the future. Grace was fascinated by John's business and even offered him ideas to make it more efficient. One evening, as they discussed new ways to reach more people with his recycling program, Grace suggested a unique partnership with local businesses. She explained how the partnership could benefit both parties and even bring more attention to his work. John was impressed by her insight and decided to put her idea into action. Her idea worked wonders. Not only did his business grow, but it also caught the attention of the media. And soon enough, people across Lagos were talking about John's impact on the environment. Grateful and overwhelmed by her support, John realized he was falling in love with Grace. He saw in her everything he had dreamed of in a partner: kindness, intelligence, and a heart full of compassion. She had given him something he had been searching for his entire life: a sense of belonging. As his feelings for her deepened, John began to think about building a future together. He had finally found someone who cared for him, who believed in him, and who was willing to stand by his side through every challenge. The lonely boy who once roamed the streets of Lagos now dreamed of a life filled with love and companionship, all because of Grace. Grace became the light in John's life, a steady friend and a comforting presence. With her, he felt safe to share his dreams and fears, something he'd never had the chance to do before. Their friendship quickly grew stronger, and soon enough, John realized he wanted to be with Grace not just as a friend, but as a life partner. After one particularly successful business event, Grace and John went out to celebrate. They spent hours laughing and talking about everything, from his childhood on the streets to her own dreams of making a difference in the world. Grace was passionate about helping people, and her kindness was what had first drawn John to her. He couldn't help but think that meeting her was like finding the missing piece of his life. Over the next few weeks, they spent even more time together. John was amazed by how Grace seemed to understand him better than anyone ever had. One evening, as they were walking by the beach, John gathered the courage to share his feelings. "Grace," he began, his voice soft, "I don't know how to say this, but you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. I don't know where I'd be without you. You've been there for me, supported me, and believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself." Grace listened quietly, her gaze never leaving his. She had a gentle smile on her face, and John felt his heart race as he continued. "Hey, I don't want to just be friends, Grace. I love you and I want to be with you." For a moment, there was silence as she processed his words. Then, to his relief, Grace reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. "I love you too, John," she replied softly. "I've been waiting for you to say that." John's heart soared. He felt like all the loneliness he'd ever felt was finally fading, replaced by a warmth he hadn't known he needed. They walked together in silence, hand in hand, both feeling as if they had found exactly what they'd been searching for. Their relationship blossomed, and before long, they were making plans for a future together. Grace continued to help John with his business, bringing fresh ideas and a new perspective that kept things exciting and innovative. With her by his side, John felt invincible. The business grew even faster, catching the attention of more influential figures in Lagos and beyond. But life, as always, had its own plans. One afternoon, John was at home going over some business documents when the doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone, so he was curious as to who it could be. When he opened the door, he saw an older woman, her face lined with wrinkles and her clothes worn and faded. She looked tired and fragile, her hands trembling slightly as she held onto a small bag. John didn't recognize her at first, but there was something hauntingly familiar in her eyes. She looked at him with a mix of hope and regret, her voice soft as she said, "John, my son." His heart stopped. The word son echoed in his mind, filling him with a mixture of shock and disbelief. This woman, his mother. After all these years, he took a step back, his mind racing. Memories of his childhood came flooding back. The endless days on the streets, the loneliness, the struggle to survive. All of it because she had left him. He felt a rush of anger, pain, and betrayal. How could she show up now, after he'd worked so hard to make something of himself? "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cold and distant. Mama Agatha's face fell, and she lowered her gaze. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, John. I was young, foolish, and I didn't know how to be a mother. I made mistakes. I left you because I thought you'd be better off. But I was wrong. I've regretted it every day since." Her words stirred something deep inside him, but his anger was stronger. How could he forgive her after everything she had put him through? He wanted to slam the door and pretend she'd never come, to keep the life he'd built for himself without her presence to disturb it. Just as he was about to send her away, Grace entered the room. She looked at the woman kneeling at the door and then at John, her face filled with confusion. "Who is this?" she asked softly. John panicked. He didn't want Grace to know the truth, didn't want her to see this broken, painful part of his past. Without thinking, he answered, She's my maid." Mama Agatha's eyes widened in shock, but she didn't say a word. She looked at her son with sadness, realizing the extent of his hurt. Silently, she accepted his lie and lowered her head, her hands trembling as she clutched her small bag. Grace was surprised but didn't question it further. She trusted John, and if he said this woman was a maid, she believed him. However, she couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. There was a tension in John's voice, a hint of bitterness she hadn't heard before. She watched as he looked away, his face hard and unreadable. John allowed Mama Agatha to stay, but his intentions were clear. He wanted her to feel the pain he had felt. He assigned her tasks around the house, giving her the role of a live-in maid. Every morning, Mama Agatha would wake early, silently preparing breakfast, cleaning the house, and completing the endless tasks John assigned. She never complained, accepting her role without question. Her eyes held a quiet sadness, but she carried herself with a sense of resignation, as if she believed she deserved this treatment. John's resentment simmered every time he saw her. He remembered the nights he had spent alone on the streets, wondering why he had no family, why he was different from other children. All the hurt he had kept inside for so long seemed to fuel his anger now. He wanted her to feel the emptiness he had lived with, the loneliness he had fought against every day. Grace, however, was not oblivious to his behavior. She watched the way John treated Mama Agatha, her concern growing with each passing day. She knew John had been through a lot, but the harshness he showed this old woman disturbed her. The kindness she had always admired in him seemed to vanish whenever he looked at Mama Agatha. One day, Grace decided to address it. She found John in his office, sitting at his desk, deep in thought. She approached him quietly and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "John," she said softly, "I need to talk to you about something." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. I don't understand why you're so harsh with her. I know there's a lot of pain, but she's an old woman now. Every time you shout at her or make her work beyond her strength, it feels wrong. John's jaw tightened and he turned away, avoiding her gaze. He knew she was right, but the anger was hard to release. It had become a part of him, something he had clung to for so long that it felt like letting it go would mean losing a part of himself. She doesn't deserve my kindness, Grace, he replied, his voice low and strained. She left me when I was just a child. I was alone. All those years. She was supposed to be my mother, but she abandoned me. Grace nodded, understanding his pain but also seeing the toll it was taking on him. She sat down beside him, her hand resting gently on his. John, I can't imagine what you went through. But I see what this anger is doing to you. You've worked so hard to build a good life for yourself, to find happiness. Don't let this bitterness poison it. You don't have to forgive her fully right away, but maybe there's a middle ground. John listened, his heart heavy. Part of him wanted to let go of the anger, but another part of him clung to it, afraid that forgiving her would somehow erase all the pain he had endured. That evening, while John was still wrestling with his feelings, something happened that forced him to confront his emotions head-on. He was in the living room when he heard raised voices from the kitchen. Curious, he went to see what was happening, only to find Grace talking to Mama Agatha. Grace's voice was gentle but firm as she tried to comfort her. Mama Agatha, I know things have been difficult, but you don't have to feel like you're just a maid here. You're family. Mama Agatha's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. No, my dear. I don't deserve to be treated as family. I left John when he needed me the most. He has every right to hate me. Her words struck John like a blow. For the first time, he saw the depth of her regret, the guilt she carried with her every day. She wasn't just an old woman trying to stay in his life. She was a mother desperate for a second chance. Grace turned to John, her eyes pleading. John, I think it's time you both talked about what happened. Really talked. John felt a surge of anger and pain rise within him, but he knew Grace was right. Avoiding the conversation wouldn't change anything. He nodded reluctantly, and Grace left the kitchen, giving them privacy. John looked at Mama Agatha, his heart pounding. He took a deep breath, his voice shaky but determined. Why did you leave me? I was just a child, and you left me to fend for myself. Do you have any idea what that did to me? Mama Agatha's shoulders slumped, and she wiped a tear from her cheek. Her voice was barely a whisper. I was young, John. Foolish. I thought I was doing what was best for both of us. I had nothing, no job, no family support. I was scared, and I made a terrible choice. I thought you'd be better off without me, but I was wrong. I was so wrong. John's anger softened slightly as he saw the pain etched on her face. The woman standing before him wasn't the same person who had left him all those years ago. She was a mother who had suffered from her own mistakes, a mother who had come back, hoping for forgiveness. But you had a choice, he said, his voice breaking. You could have stayed. You could have tried. Instead, you left me. I was just a little boy, and I didn't understand why my mother didn't want me. Mama Agatha took a trembling step toward him, her hands outstretched. John, I know I can't undo the past, but I came back because I wanted to make things right. I wanted you to know that leaving you was the worst decision I ever made. I can never change what I did, but I am here now, hoping you can find it in your heart to forgive me. John felt a lump in his throat as he looked at her. He wanted to hate her, wanted to push her away, but something inside him was shifting. He saw her regret, her sorrow, and for the first time, he wondered if holding on to his anger was hurting him more than it was hurting her. He took a deep breath and nodded slowly. I don't know if I can fully forgive you, but maybe we can start over, in a way. I can help you find a place to live, and I can help you start a small business so you can support yourself. We don't have to live together, but maybe we can try to reconnect. Mama Agatha's eyes filled with hope, and she nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. That would mean the world to me, John. I don't expect miracles. I just want a chance to be a part of your life, even if only in a small way. John felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he made this decision. He didn't know if he could ever fully forgive her, but taking this step felt like a release from the anger that had haunted him for so long. As he turned to leave the kitchen, he saw Grace standing in the doorway, her eyes filled with pride and love. She wrapped her arms around him, whispering, "I'm so proud of you, John." With Grace's support and the promise of a new beginning, John finally felt a sense of peace. He didn't know what the future held for him and Mama Agatha, but he was willing to take the first step, to open his heart just a little, and to see where the journey would lead. With the decision made, John set out to find a small, comfortable place for Mama Agatha. He didn't want her to remain as a maid in his home. Instead, he wanted her to have her own space, a chance to start over with dignity. He used some of his savings to rent her a modest apartment nearby, and even set up a small business where she could sell handmade crafts. It wasn't grand, but it was enough for her to support herself, and it gave her a sense of purpose. The day he handed her the keys, Mama Agatha's eyes brimmed with tears. She held the keys tightly, looking up at him with gratitude and relief. "Thank you, John," she whispered. "I know I don't deserve this kindness, but thank you." John gave her a small, hesitant smile. "I'm not doing this out of kindness. I'm doing this because maybe it's time we try to move forward. But remember, this doesn't mean I've completely forgiven you. I'm still trying." Mama Agatha nodded, understanding. She didn't expect complete forgiveness. She knew it would take time. But this gesture, this willingness to give her a chance, was more than she had hoped for. She promised herself she would earn his trust and love again, however long it took. Over the next few months, John visited Mama Agatha occasionally, checking on her and the business he had set up for her. At first, their interactions were formal and brief, with John keeping his guard up. But each visit became a bit easier, and with Grace's encouragement, he started to open up, sharing small bits of his life and his achievements. Mama Agatha listened intently, always looking at him with pride and amazement. She knew she had missed so much of his life. His struggles, his victories, his growth. But now, she was grateful for every moment she could spend with him, no matter how brief. Slowly, the walls between them began to crumble, replaced by a fragile bond that grew stronger with each visit. One evening, John and Grace invited Mama Agatha to dinner at their home. It was the first time they had welcomed her as a guest rather than a maid, and Mama Agatha couldn't hide the joy in her eyes. She dressed in her best clothes, her face glowing with excitement and hope. During dinner they talked and laughed, sharing stories from their lives. Mama Agatha listened eagerly to John's tales about his business, and Grace shared her own stories about their dreams for the future. Mama Agatha felt a warmth she hadn't felt in years, a feeling of belonging that she had thought she had lost forever. At one point, Grace excused herself to get dessert, leaving John and Mama Agatha alone. There was a quiet pause, and then Mama Agatha spoke, her voice soft but full of emotion. "John, I know I've said it before, but I am truly sorry. Every day I carry the weight of what I did. I know I can never change the past, but if there's anything I can do to make things right, I will." John looked at her, the familiar anger and hurt still lingering but now softened by a new understanding. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Mama Agatha," he began, his voice steady, "I've spent so many years being angry, blaming you for everything. I thought that by hating you I could somehow erase the pain. But now, I realize that holding on to that anger has only hurt me. I've missed out on so much because I was too focused on the past." He paused, searching her face, and saw only sincerity and regret. "I don't know if I'll ever forget what happened, but maybe I can forgive you. Maybe we can try to rebuild something. I think that's what I want now." Mama Agatha's eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "That's all I ever hoped for, John. Just a chance. Thank you." In that moment, something shifted in John's heart. He felt the weight of years of resentment lift, replaced by a sense of relief and a tentative hope for the future. It wasn't complete forgiveness, but it was a start. a chance to heal and to move forward. Grace returned with dessert, noticing the change in the room, the softness in their expressions. She gave John an encouraging smile, proud of the man he had become, the man who had found the strength to forgive. The months that followed marked a new chapter in John's life. Did you enjoy this story? What country are you watching from? Tell me in the comments so I can give you a special shout out.